A poor girl runs to a billionaire's mansion yelling, "Don't drink the tea." Everyone laughs, until the pregnant wife collapses. But that's just the beginning. What the husband uncovers next will make you question how far people will go to protect their money and destroy their own blood. Before we begin, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? United States, Canada, Malaysia, UK, Australia, Jamaica. The wind rolled off the Charles River sharp and cold that Saturday morning, rattling the iron gates of the Harrington estate. Autumn had set the trees of Concord on fire, amber, gold, and red leaves tumbling across the gravel driveway where luxury cars gleamed like sculptures. From behind a maple trunk across the street, Lydia Hanlon, 7 years old and wearing a thrift store coat 2 sizes too big, watched the scene unfold with the kind of stillness that only comes from hunger and fear. Her sneakers were duct-taped at the toes, her backpack torn, but her eyes, clear hazel with flecks of green, never stopped moving. Inside the gates, the Harringtons' annual harvest brunch was in full swing. Waiters carried trays of smoked salmon and cranberry scones, laughter drifted from the heated tents, and a jazz trio played Sinatra near the reflecting pool. To everyone there, it was another picture-perfect charity event. To Lydia, it was another world. She hadn't meant to come this close. She'd only followed the smell of food from Main Street after a night sleeping behind a closed diner. But something about the woman in the pale blue maternity dress, Eleanor Harrington, held her attention. Eleanor looked kind, the way Lydia's mother used to look before the hospitals and the pills. A waiter approached Eleanor with a silver tray. 3 porcelain teacups steamed gently. The sunlight caught one of them just right and Lydia froze. On the rim of the middle cup, a faint shimmer, like crushed glass. She blinked, leaned closer through the bars. The shimmer stayed. Her mother's voice flickered in her mind. "If it sparkles where it shouldn't, baby, don't let anyone drink it." Lydia's pulse raced. She didn't think. She ran straight toward the gates, breath puffing in clouds. "Don't drink the tea," she screamed. Heads turned instantly. The jazz stopped mid-note. 50 guests stared as a dirty little girl pressed her face to the wrought iron. "What on earth?" someone gasped. "They put something in it?" Lydia cried, pointing with shaking hands. "The middle cup, don't drink it." Security moved before anyone else did. 2 men in suits hurried toward her. "Get her away from here," barked Charles Harrington, the family patriarch, silver hair, charcoal coat, and an expression carved from money and disdain. But it was too late. Grant Harrington, his son, the billionaire entrepreneur whose name sat on half the tech startups in New England, had already turned toward the commotion. His wife, Eleanor, hesitated, teacup still halfway to her lips. Grant frowned. "Wait," Eleanor put that down. She blinked, confused. "Grant, it's chamomile?" Then she swayed. The cup slipped from her hand and shattered against the flagstones. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Eleanor." Grant caught her just before she hit the ground. The porcelain shards scattered like ice around his shoes. Paramedics were called within minutes. Guests whispered, phones recorded, and the girl outside the gate kept screaming until a guard gripped her shoulders. "I told her not to drink it. I saw it sparkle. You have to believe me." But nobody did. Not yet. 30 minutes later, the Harrington driveway was filled with flashing lights. Eleanor was conscious but pale, oxygen mask in place as EMTs lifted her into the ambulance. Grant followed close behind, his tailored jacket streaked with spilled tea. He looked once more toward the gate. The child was still there, trembling under a police officer's blanket. For a moment their eyes met. Something in her gaze, defiance mixed with fear, hit him like a memory he couldn't place. "Sir?" an officer asked. "You know this kid?" Grant hesitated. "No," he said automatically. "At least I don't think so." But the uncertainty in his voice lingered. At Massachusetts General Hospital, initial tests found trace cyanide compounds in Eleanor's bloodstream. Sublethal but real. The tea had been poisoned. When the news reached the estate, chaos erupted. The catering staff were interrogated, security footage reviewed, and every guest questioned. Yet the only person who'd noticed anything wrong before it happened was that little girl outside the gate. By sundown, Lydia was sitting in a small room at the Concord police station, swinging her legs nervously while Detective Marla O'Rourke took notes. "You're saying you saw someone tamper with the tea?" Lydia nodded. "He had white hair. Fancy watch." He poured something from a tiny bottle, then stirred it with a spoon. Marla frowned. "You're sure it wasn't a waiter?" "He wasn't wearing gloves," Lydia said quietly. "The waiters all had gloves." Marla exchanged a look with her partner. Every waiter on the Harrington staff wore white gloves, That detail hadn't been publicized. Outside the interview room, Grant stood by the glass window watching. He'd come straight from the hospital. Eleanor was stable now, doctors optimistic. But nothing felt real. "Detective," he said when Marla stepped out, "can I talk to her?" "You can try," Marla replied. "She's skittish but she's sharp. Smarter than most adults I've met." Grant entered the room slowly. Lydia stared at the floor, twisting the frayed strap of her backpack. "Hey," he said gently. "I'm Grant. My wife's the woman you saved." She looked up. "Is she okay?" "She will be," he said. "Thanks to you." Silence stretched. Then Grant noticed the locket around her neck, old brass, heart-shaped, its hinge rusted. Something about it tugged at his chest. "Can I see that?" he asked. Lydia hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman smiling beside a man in a college sweatshirt. The man was unmistakably younger Grant Harrington. He went still. "Where did you get this?" "My mom gave it to me," Lydia whispered. "She said if I ever found the man in the picture, he'd know what to do." Grant's throat tightened. "What was your mother's name?" "Camille Hanlon." The name hit him like a punch. Camille. His first love. The woman who vanished without a word 12 years ago. Outside, Marla peeked through the glass, sensing something seismic happening inside. Grant whispered, "How old are you, Lydia?" 7. He did the math automatically. Camille's disappearance, the timing, the haunting familiarity of those hazel eyes. Before he could speak again, his phone buzzed. A call from his father. He answered. "Dad." Charles Harrington's voice was calm, too calm. "Grant, forget the child. These things attract attention. We'll handle it quietly." Grant looked at Lydia, then out the window toward the darkening Massachusetts skyline. "No," he said slowly. "Not this time." And that's where everything started to unravel. I poured my heart into this story because I believe real emotions still matter. My girlfriend laughed and said I'd never even reach 1,000 subscribers. She might be right, unless someone like you proves her wrong. Please hit subscribe, not for me alone but for the stories that deserve to be heard. The next morning broke gray over Concord, the kind of November light that felt too tired to warm anything. At the Harrington estate, security trucks idled on the gravel drive while reporters camped at the gates, their breath visible in the cold air. Every headline in Boston said the same thing. Billionaire's wife poisoned at charity brunch. Inside, Grant Harrington hadn't slept. He stood at the window of his home office, looking out across the frozen lawn where the tea table still sat abandoned, like ghosts of yesterday's perfection. His phone buzzed constantly, investors, lawyers, PR teams, but his mind was fixed on the face of that little girl. Lydia Hanlon. He'd spent half the night replaying her words, her eyes, the locket, the name Camille Hanlon. Too many coincidences. Too much that didn't make sense. Downstairs, the sound of heels clicked against the marble floor. Eleanor was awake, wrapped in a blanket, pale but steady. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said softly. "I might have," Grant murmured. Eleanor frowned. "Is it about the girl?" Grant nodded. "She's not just some kid off the street. I think she's connected to me. To before you and I met." "Connected how?" He turned, holding up the locket he hadn't been able to let go of. Her mother's name was Camille Hanlon. Eleanor's face shifted, first confusion then understanding. "Your college girlfriend? The one your father didn't approve of?" Grant nodded. "The same." The silence between them stretched. Eleanor set her tea down carefully. "Grant, if that child is yours." He cut her off. "I don't know yet. But I need to find out. And I need to know who tried to kill you." At Concord Police Headquarters, Detective Marla O'Rourke sat across from Lydia again. The girl had been given clean clothes and a warm breakfast, but her guarded posture hadn't changed. "Lydia, I want to show you something," Marla said, sliding a photo across the table. It was a screenshot from security footage, the catering tent, the tea station. A man's hand hovered over the teacups. Silver hair. A gold watch. "That's him," Lydia whispered. "The one who put the stuff in the tea." Marla looked at the still image again. The reflection on the picture showed part of the man's face. It wasn't one of the waiters. It wasn't even one of the staff. It was Charles Harrington. "Wait, it gets crazier," Marla muttered under her breath. That afternoon she met Grant in his downtown office overlooking the Charles River. The city glimmered through the fog, beautiful and cold. "You're saying the person who poisoned my wife was my father?" he asked in disbelief. Marla folded her arms. I'm saying the security footage shows your father's watch and his reflection near the tea right before the poisoning. The staff confirm he was there. Grant sank into his chair, exhaling. Jesus. Any reason your father would want your wife harmed? Marla pressed. Grant hesitated. Eleanor's pregnant with twins. My father's been pressuring me to update the family trust. The inheritance would shift. Marla raised an eyebrow. Money. Grant nodded grimly. Always money. Meanwhile, Lydia sat in a foster holding room in Cambridge. Her hands fiddled with the string of her locket as social workers whispered outside the door. Every few minutes she looked at the clock. She didn't trust these people. Not after the last foster home, the shouting, the nights hiding in closets. But she remembered Grant's face, the way his eyes softened when she said her mother's name. Something in her chest told her he wouldn't forget her. And she was right. By sunset, Grant walked into the holding center, his suit wrinkled, eyes bloodshot. I'm taking her with me, he told the social worker. At least until the investigation's complete. That's highly irregular, Mr. Harrington, the woman began. He cut her off. So is poisoning my wife. 10 minutes later, Lydia sat in the passenger seat of a black Range Rover, clutching a blanket as they drove through the quiet Massachusetts backroads toward Boston. She stared out the window at the lights flickering through bare trees. Where are we going? She asked. To my home, Grant said. You'll be safe there. Lydia looked at him, cautious. You don't have to help me. Yes, he said quietly. I do. Eleanor met them at the door. She'd heard everything, the footage, the suspicion, the possibility that Lydia was family. When she saw the child, her expression softened instantly. You must be Lydia, she said, kneeling down despite the weight of her pregnancy. You saved my life. Lydia's shoulders stiffened, unsure how to respond. No one had ever thanked her before. I just saw the sparkle, she murmured. Eleanor smiled faintly. Sometimes that's all it takes, seeing what others miss. Grant watched them, that ache in his chest growing heavier. He'd spent a lifetime building things, companies, investments, reputations, but none of it felt as real as this moment. A sick wife, a frightened child, and a truth he'd spent years ignoring. Later that night, after Lydia had fallen asleep in a guest room that was bigger than any space she'd ever called her own, Grant poured himself a drink and stared at the locket again. The photo inside hadn't changed, but what it meant had. He remembered Camille laughing on a windy day at MIT's campus green. Her eyes had been the same color as Lydia's. You promised you'd never let your family come between us, she'd said once. He had broken that promise. Now her daughter slept upstairs. The doorbell rang just before midnight. When Grant opened it, his father stood there, immaculate as ever, flanked by a lawyer. Grant, Charles said coolly. We need to talk. Grant didn't invite him in. About what? The attempted murder of my wife. Charles's jaw flexed. Careful what you say. The press will twist it. The press didn't poison my wife. Charles's expression didn't change, but his voice lowered. You're letting that child fill your head with nonsense. She's a vagrant. She doesn't belong here. Grant's pulse ticked faster. She's Camille's daughter. Camille is dead, Charles snapped. And you'd be wise to leave her memory buried. She was unstable, she threatened to destroy this family. Grant stepped closer. She didn't destroy it. You did. Charles's eyes hardened. You have no idea what power you're playing with, son? Grant's voice was low but shaking. Maybe not. But I know what kind of man poisons a pregnant woman. For the first time the old man's mask cracked. His pupils flared, his hand gripping the doorframe like a vice. Then, with chilling composure, he said, Some stains can't be scrubbed clean, Grant. Not even by money. Be careful which side of this you stand on. He turned and walked back into the night, his driver's headlights flashing across the snow-dusted driveway. Grant closed the door, heart pounding. Upstairs, he could hear Lydia stir in her sleep, murmuring something about her mother. He poured out his drink, realizing the irony. The same amber liquid that once symbolized comfort now looked like poison. He stood there in the silence, the truth circling him like a storm he could no longer outrun. Because if Lydia was right, and if that letter Camille had promised to send still existed, then everything he thought he knew about his family, his legacy, and himself was about to be shattered. And this time he wasn't going to look away. The following week crept by like a long gray breath over Massachusetts. Outside, the first flakes of December drifted across the Charles, but inside the Harrington brownstone, warmth felt impossible. Grant sat at his desk surrounded by folders, contracts, and decades of secrets. Somewhere between the files, the truth was hiding and he could feel it breathing. Eleanor kept mostly to bed, regaining strength. Lydia had started drawing again, small pencil sketches of butterflies, teacups, and city skylines. Sometimes when Grant passed her room, he'd hear her humming softly. That sound, childlike and fragile, was the only thing that reminded him there was still light left in this house. Then one morning, a courier delivered an envelope addressed in handwriting that made Grant's hands shake. Camille Hanlon. He stared at it for a full minute before opening it. Inside lay a single folded letter and a key marked Box 311, Cambridge Trust Bank. Grant, it began. If you're reading this, it means I didn't survive long enough to tell you the truth. His throat tightened as he read. When I found out I was pregnant, I tried to reach you. But your father came first. He said the family name couldn't afford another scandal. He offered money, then threats. When I refused, he promised that if I ever told you about the baby, he'd make sure you both disappeared. Grant's vision blurred. He read on. I took the money only to keep her safe. Our daughter, Lydia, was born on February 14th. She has your eyes, your temper, and your stubborn heart. I've hidden proof of everything, letters, bank statements, recordings, in Box 311. If she ever finds you, tell her I loved her every day, even from the shadows. Grant sat back, the room spinning. He'd spent years convincing himself Camille had left because she'd fallen out of love. Now he saw it. She'd vanished to save their child from his own father. Wait, it gets crazier, Detective Marla O'Rourke said 2 hours later when Grant handed her the letter. We've been tracing those cyanide compounds from the tea. Guess where they came from? Don't tell me, Harrington Labs. She nodded. Specifically, a restricted formula your father's company was developing for pest control. Someone accessed it using his private credentials. Grant rubbed his forehead. So he tried to poison my wife with his own product. Marla sighed. This isn't just family drama anymore, Grant. It's corporate homicide. Grant met her gaze. Then we bring him down. That evening he took Lydia to Cambridge Trust. Snow slushed beneath their boots as they stepped inside the marble lobby. The clerk hesitated at first but opened Box 311 after Grant showed the key. Inside lay a small wooden box wrapped in faded blue ribbon. Lydia clutched it as if it were alive. Back at the brownstone they opened it together. Old photographs. Receipts from offshore accounts. Handwritten notes. And a flash drive labeled, for Lydia, when she's safe. Grant plugged it into his laptop. A video file appeared. Camille's face filled the screen, older, thinner, but unmistakably her. Lydia, she said softly, if you're seeing this, I'm gone. And Grant, if you're watching too, I need you to listen. She described the Harrington Foundation as a shell company used to funnel hush payments to victims of corporate accidents. People who had lost children, health, lives. Charles had silenced them for decades. Grant's stomach churned. My God. Camille's voice cracked near the end of the recording. He told me he'd rather burn the family empire to the ground than let you share it with a child like ours. Promise me you'll keep her safe. The screen went dark. Lydia wiped her eyes. She sounds kind. Grant nodded, voice breaking. She was. The next day, Grant drove to his father's estate in Ipswich. The winter sun bounced off the frozen pond as he parked outside the Georgian mansion he'd once called home. Charles was waiting in the study, fire roaring behind him, a tumbler of scotch in hand. Son, he said evenly, I assume this visit means you've come to your senses. Grant placed the wooden box on the table. Actually, it means I finally see what kind of man you are. Charles's gaze flicked to the box, then back to his son. I see Camille's little treasure chest found its way home. You threatened her. You took everything from her. I preserved this family, Charles corrected. You were too sentimental to understand what legacy costs. Legacy? Grant's voice rose. You poisoned my wife, tried to kill my children, and left your granddaughter to freeze on the street. Charles's calm cracked for the first time. I did what was necessary. Necessary for what? Control? For survival, Charles hissed. You think our fortune built itself? Every generation has its sacrifices. She was one of them. Grant stepped closer. Not anymore. Before Charles could reply, voices filled the hallway. Detective Marla and 2 state troopers entered, badges flashing. Charles Harrington, Marla said, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and corporate fraud. Charles laughed softly. You have no evidence that will hold in court. Marla tilted her head. Actually, we do. Your late daughter-in-law's video was time-stamped, authenticated, and already filed with the district attorney. For a heartbeat, the old man's composure faltered. Then he whispered, "You betrayed your own blood." Grant looked him straight in the eye. "No. I finally protected it." 2 days later, headlines screamed again. Harrington patriarch arrested in murder conspiracy. The empire crumbled overnight. Stocks plummeted, board members resigned, and Grant resigned as CEO. The public called it justice. For him, it felt like ashes. Eleanor held his hand through it all, quiet strength in her tired eyes. Lydia never left their side. She'd started sleeping without nightmares the way children should. One evening, as snow drifted against the window, she asked, "Will my grandpa go to jail forever?" Grant hesitated. Maybe not forever. But long enough to understand what he did. Lydia thought about that. Mom said bad people do bad things because they forget what love feels like. Grant smiled faintly. She was right. Weeks later, they visited Camille's grave at Mount Auburn Cemetery. The air smelled of pine and cold earth. Lydia placed a drawing on the headstone, a butterfly resting on a teacup. Grant knelt beside her. "She'd be proud of you." Lydia looked up. "Are we safe now?" He nodded. "We're getting there." As they walked back toward the car, Boston's skyline glimmered in the distance. For the first time in years, Grant felt something like peace. But beneath it lay a quiet guilt, because none of this would have happened if he'd listened years ago. He turned to Lydia. "You saved us, you know." She smiled shyly. "I just paid attention." He laughed softly. "That's more than most adults ever do." When they got home, Eleanor was waiting with tea, real tea this time from a sealed tin she'd brewed herself. The scent of chamomile filled the room. Grant hesitated before taking a sip. "It's safe," Eleanor teased. "I checked twice." He smiled, but his eyes flicked to Lydia, who was already sketching again by the firelight. She glanced up. "See? No sparkle this time." Grant chuckled. "No sparkle." Outside, snow began to fall heavier, blanketing the city in quiet forgiveness. And for a brief moment, everything was still, until the phone rang. Grant answered. Detective Marla's voice crackled through. "Grant, you might want to sit down. We just uncovered offshore files tied to your father's partners. This goes beyond Massachusetts. Way beyond." He looked at Eleanor, then at Lydia. The storm wasn't over, it had only shifted coasts. By the end of this story, if you felt even a heartbeat of what Grant and Lydia fought for, family, truth, and second chances, don't just close this page. Stay with us. Because stories like this remind us that paying attention can save lives, that love can rewrite legacies, and that somewhere out there, another Lydia is waiting to be heard. Subscribe, stay kind, and keep your eyes open, because the next warning might come from someone the world forgot to notice. The first thaw of March turned Massachusetts mud gray and heavy. A low mist hung over the Harrington estate, muting the world like a held breath. Inside, the air felt no lighter. Every clock ticked too loudly, every shadow stretched too long. Grant stood at the foot of the staircase watching Lydia draw at the dining table. The news had moved on from their family's scandal, but the aftermath hadn't. Charles Harrington had been released on house arrest pending trial. Victor, Grant's older brother, had vanished somewhere between London and Zurich. And yet, despite all the ruin, the empire still pulsed beneath the surface. Too many people with too much to lose. "Daddy?" Lydia's small voice broke his thoughts. "Are we gonna see Grandpa again?" Grant hesitated. "Soon. But it won't be easy." Eleanor entered with a cup of decaf coffee, her belly smaller now, twins born early but healthy. "It's never easy when truth starts costing money," she said softly. Grant smiled faintly. "That's one way to put it." By the end of that week, he received an unmarked envelope slid beneath his office door. Inside was a single note typed on plain paper. "Stop digging. The board won't fall alone." Grant stared at the words until they blurred. "They're threatening the family," he muttered. Eleanor crossed her arms. "So what now?" "We end it. All of it." He called Detective Marla O'Rourke. "Can we get my father to talk before the trial?" She paused. "If you can get him to slip, yes. But you'll need witnesses and audio. Legally clean." Grant exhaled. "Then we bring him home." On a cold Friday afternoon, he arranged a family meeting at the Ipswich mansion. Officially, it was to discuss transferring company shares to charity. Unofficially, it was a trap. He arrived with Eleanor, Lydia, and 2 plainclothes officers posing as staff. Hidden microphones hummed quietly under the mahogany table. When Charles entered, flanked by his lawyer and Victor, back from whatever hole he'd crawled out of, the room's temperature dropped 10 degrees. The patriarch looked older, his skin gray around the edges, but his eyes still carried that icy authority. "So, Charles said, lowering himself into the chair. The prodigal son calls another tribunal. I'm done with tribunals, Grant replied. I want confessions. Victor smirked. Always the dramatist. You really think this little reunion changes anything? Grant pressed play on a tablet. Camille's final video appeared on screen, her voice echoing through the study. Charles Harrington threatened my unborn child. Charles's jaw tightened. Enough. But Grant let the recording finish. When it ended, silence filled the room except for the steady click of the grandfather clock. Eleanor looked at her father-in-law squarely. You could stop this right now, Charles. Admit what you did. He swirled the ice in his glass. Admit to saving my legacy? No, Eleanor. You're welcome. Victor leaned forward. Father, maybe it's time? Quiet, Charles snapped. You don't speak until I say so. Lydia flinched at the tone. Grant saw it and his resolve hardened. You called threatening letters, saving a legacy? You called murder business strategy? Charles's gaze flicked toward Lydia. That child standing there with her wide eyes, she's living proof that weakness infects bloodlines. You were supposed to learn that lesson. Eleanor gasped. You're talking about your own granddaughter. She's not family, Charles hissed. She's the consequence of your father's softness. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Lydia stepped closer to the table, trembling but fierce. You're wrong, she said. Family's who protects you, not who hurts you. Grant reached for her shoulder, but she kept talking. Mama said bad people hide behind big houses. But the house always falls if you take out the lies first. Victor gave a short laugh. A philosopher at 7. Charming. Lydia's eyes narrowed. You laughed at the tea too. The color drained from his face. What? She's bluffing, Charles said quickly. But Lydia wasn't. She pointed at him. I saw you hand the bottle to the man who served the drinks. Mama told me to remember people's hands. Yours had a scar. Victor's hand twitched toward his cufflink, where a small burn scar indeed crossed his wrist. Detective Marla, listening from the van outside, mouthed, Got it. She signaled the team to stand by. Charles slammed his fist on the table. Enough. You think you can destroy me with bedtime stories? Grant stood. No. With evidence. The recording's been live since you walked in. Charles's face blanched, then darkened. You dare. Stop. Victor cut in, voice suddenly sharp. She's right. Charles turned slowly toward his eldest son. What are you saying? Victor's composure cracked, years of fear spilling out. You made me do it. You said the baby would ruin everything, that the trust couldn't handle more heirs. You said. I said handle it. Charles barked. And I did. Victor shouted, voice breaking. I gave the bottle to the caterer. You said it was just to make her sick, not? The sound of sirens sliced through the air outside. Marla burst in with her team. Charles Harrington, Victor Harrington, you're both under arrest for attempted homicide and conspiracy. The room erupted. Victor tried to bolt, shoving the chair aside, but an officer tackled him near the fireplace. Charles staggered backward, clutching his chest. Father. Grant moved reflexively, but Charles waved him off, face ashen. Don't touch me, he rasped. You always thought you were better. Now look at you, kneeling in filth with your mongrel family. He tried to lift his glass again, but his hands trembled violently. The tumbler slipped, shattering across the rug. He collapsed as the paramedics rushed in. Grant stood frozen. The man who had dictated every breath of his childhood now lay crumpled on the floor, the Empire's king reduced to a frail body gasping for air. Marla checked his pulse. He's alive. Barely. Lydia clung to Eleanor's leg, whispering. He looks scared. Eleanor stroked her hair. Everyone's scared when the truth catches up. Outside, the night smelled of rain and gasoline. Blue and red lights painted the trees. Reporters were already gathering at the gates, their voices overlapping like a swarm. Grant walked away from the mansion, shoes sinking into wet earth. He didn't speak until they reached the car. Eleanor finally asked, Do you regret it? He shook his head slowly. No. Only that it took this long. They drove in silence down the winding road back toward Boston. Lydia sat in the back seat between the sleeping twins, clutching her sketchbook. When they passed the bridge over the frozen river, she looked up. Daddy? Yes, sweetheart. Does the truth ever stop hurting? Grant met her eyes in the rearview mirror. It doesn't stop hurting, he said softly. But it starts healing. Lydia nodded, as if she understood more than her years should allow, and turned back to the window where the city lights blurred into streaks of gold. Behind them, sirens faded into the distance, swallowed by fog. In the quiet that followed, Grant finally exhaled, a slow, trembling release of everything he'd carried since the moment Lydia shouted through the gates months ago. The war for the family's soul was over. The cleanup, the trials, the headlines, they would come. But for the first time he felt the weight of guilt lifting, replaced by something fragile and new. Hope. And though none of them spoke it aloud, they all knew, this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the moment the ghosts stopped whispering, and the living began to rebuild. Spring came late to Massachusetts that year, the kind that arrived cautiously, one hesitant bud at a time. At the Harrington brownstone, new light spilled through windows that had once felt haunted. The echo of sirens had long faded, but the memories hadn't. Grant stood at the kitchen counter, staring at a stack of legal documents. The trial transcripts lay open beside the morning paper. Harrington patriarch dies awaiting sentencing. Charles Harrington had suffered a second heart attack 2 weeks after his arrest. Victor had taken a plea deal. The empire was gone. Lydia padded into the room in her socks, hair still messy from sleep. "You're reading that again?" she said. Grant smiled tiredly. "Bad habit." She climbed onto a stool. "Mama Eleanor says when you stare too long at old things, you forget to see the new ones." He glanced at her, caught off guard by the simplicity of it. She's right. Outside, Eleanor's laughter drifted through the open window as she pushed the twin stroller down the brick path, sunlight glinting off their matching blue hats. For the first time in months, Grant allowed himself to breathe. That afternoon, they drove to a quiet hill overlooking Boston Harbor where the new Camille Hanlon Foundation for Justice had opened its doors. What had once been a banking office now held children's art on the walls, case files for family reunifications, and a plaque that read, "Because paying attention can save a life." Reporters waited, cameras ready, but Grant spoke plainly. "This isn't about my family's fall," he said into the microphones. "It's about the people who paid for our silence. We can't rewrite the past, but we can decide what kind of future our name builds next." Lydia stood beside him, holding his hand. Her small voice carried farther than anyone expected. "My mom used to say truth is like light, it hurts your eyes at first but it helps you see." The crowd went still. By summer, the foundation had become more than a headline. It was a place where victims of corporate neglect found lawyers who listened, where foster children found advocates, and where Lydia, now 8, became something of a quiet legend. Her story had gone viral, though the family rarely spoke about it. Detective Marla visited one afternoon with coffee and an exhausted smile. "You started a movement, Grant. You know that, right?" He shook his head. "Camille started it. Lydia finished it." Marla looked around the bright office. "You ever think about what your father would say if he could see this?" Grant sighed. "Probably something about tarnishing the family crest." She laughed. "Well, it's shining a lot brighter now." At home that evening, the air smelled of lilacs and grilled corn. Lydia was teaching the twins how to blow bubbles in the backyard while Eleanor set the table. Grant joined them, glass of lemonade in hand, and for a fleeting second the world looked ordinary. But when Lydia turned toward him, sunlight catching her hair, he saw Camille again, the same determination, the same calm under pressure. "Daddy," she said suddenly, "are we done fixing things?" He crouched beside her. "Maybe not done. But we're getting better at it." "Good." She smiled, blowing another bubble that floated upward before bursting. "'Cause Mama used to say broken things are just things that forgot how to be whole." He watched it rise and vanish, thinking of all the lives shattered by greed and secrecy. "We'll keep reminding them," he said. That night, after everyone was asleep, Grant sat alone in his study. The window was open, distant waves rolled against the harbor wall. On the desk lay 2 framed photos, one of Camille, one of the family now. Between them, a candle burned low. He opened the drawer and took out the letter Camille had written. Her handwriting wavered where the ink had smudged from tears. "If she ever finds you, tell her I loved her every day, even from the shadows." Grant whispered to the empty room, "She found me, Camille. You can rest now." For a moment, he thought he felt the faintest warmth pass through the air, like the soft exhale of forgiveness. 3 months later, the foundation hosted its first major case conference in Boston. Investigators from other states came to learn how to build family justice programs modeled after the Hanlon system. Eleanor handled the logistics with the precision of someone who had rebuilt her life piece by piece. Lydia greeted visitors shyly, clutching a clipboard twice her size. A television reporter asked, "Lydia, what would you tell other kids who feel invisible?" She thought for a long second. "I'd tell them that sometimes people won't believe you when you see something wrong. But you have to speak anyway. Because maybe somebody's life depends on you being brave for 5 seconds. When the segment aired that evening, the clip spread across social media. Messages flooded the foundation's inbox, teachers showing it in classrooms, parents writing to say their children wanted to be like Lydia. Grant watched it quietly from the living room couch, twins asleep on his lap. Eleanor leaned against him, whispering, "She's going to change more than just our family." He nodded. "She already has." On the anniversary of Camille's death, they visited her grave again. The cemetery had turned green with spring, the same hill where Lydia had first left her drawing months earlier. This time, she brought a jar of wildflowers from their garden. Grant knelt beside her. "Do you remember what you said last time?" She nodded. "That I hoped Mama was proud." "She is," he said. "You gave her voice back." Eleanor joined them, holding the twins. They stood there for a long moment, the four of them framed by sunlight and stone. Then Lydia pointed upward. A butterfly, orange and black, fluttered above the grave before landing on the headstone. Grant smiled through tears. "Seems she never misses an appointment." Lydia grinned. "She's saying hi." They left the flowers and walked back toward the car, the air soft and full of life. Weeks later, Grant found himself back in front of a camera, not for scandal but for a documentary about the foundation's work. The interviewer asked, "What have you learned from all of this?" Grant looked straight into the lens. That silence can be poison. That love can be louder than shame. And that sometimes it takes the smallest voice in the crowd to wake the giants who've fallen asleep at the wheel. The interviewer smiled. "You mean Lydia?" He nodded. "I mean all of them, the ones no one listens to until it's too late." That night, the final shot of the documentary showed Lydia walking through the foundation garden, her hand trailing across the flowers. The narrator's voice, Grant's voice, spoke over the music. Every family has secrets. Some destroy. Some heal. The difference is what you do when the truth finally knocks on your door. The credits rolled over footage of children reunited with parents, over Eleanor laughing with staff, over Lydia sketching butterflies in a notebook. Then, just before the screen faded to black, Grant's voice added quietly. "If you've ever looked away when you should have spoken up, if you've ever thought one small act doesn't matter, remember her. Remember the girl who saw the sparkle and said something. And maybe next time be that voice for someone else." The music swelled, soft and hopeful. Because stories like this aren't just entertainment, they're reminders. And if they stirred something in you, don't walk away empty. Stay with us. Listen, learn, and keep the light on for the next truth that needs to be seen. The camera lingered on Lydia's butterfly drawing pinned to the foundation's wall. Beneath it, in small letters, the inscription read, "For everyone who paid attention,